How to live 365 days a year. Part 1. How and why emotionally induced illness occurs. 1. Your emotions produce most of your physical disease. Probably no greater confusion exists in this confused world than the one in the minds of non-medical people concerning the type of illness loosely and erroneously described as it's your nerves. This confusion in the lay mind is not remarkable at all, since until recently confusion also existed in the medical mind. We began as recently as 1936 to understand the mechanism by which a set of emotions could produce physical disease. The medical profession's education in the matter is just underway. Between the time the profession is educated in a subject and the time the lay population generally understands it, there is usually a lapse of 20 years. Thus, we see that the educative process is in its early stages. Functional disease, or emotionally induced illness, as it had best be called, is, every way you look at it, a very, very remarkable disease. The remarkable prevalence of functional disease is one of the outstanding things, for instance, about emotionally induced illness. Emotionally induced illness is that over 50% of those seeking medical aid today have it. Put it differently, if you become ill tomorrow, or if you are ill today, the chances are a little better than 50-50 that you are ill with emotionally induced illness. Or, still another way of putting it, a big textbook of medicine, such as medical students use, contains the account of roughly 1,000 different diseases that this human clay of ours is subject to. One of these diseases, emotionally induced illness, is as common as all the other 999 put together. Perhaps it is a little hard for you, a layman, to believe these figures. But actually, they are probably on the conservative side. A few years ago, the Schindler Clinic in New Orleans published a paper which stated that 74% of 500 consecutive patients admitted to the department handling gastrointestinal diseases were found to be suffering from emotionally induced illness. And in 1951, a paper from the Yale University Outpatient Medical Department indicated that 76% of patients coming to that clinic were suffering from emotionally induced illness. One naturally asks, if this disease is so prevalent, why doesn't one hear more about it? What's the answer? The answer is as peculiar as the disease itself. Emotionally induced illness, the dark spot in modern medicine, everyone, including you and me, has had emotionally induced illness at some time or other. If you saw a physician when you had it, the chances are that the physician did not tell you what you had. There are two good reasons why he didn't. The first reason is that although physicians have always known about the disease and have been able to diagnose it for many years, it has been only in the last 10 years that we have understood it well enough to begin to talk about it. The second and most important reason the doctor did not tell you what you had arises from the peculiar method by which this disease has been treated. A doctor does not have to be in practice long to learn that merely telling a patient you have nothing wrong with you, your trouble is being produced by your emotions, or it's your nerves, is very poor therapy. It not only does the patient little or no good, but often angers him, sets him on the defensive, and sends him to another doctor. This one, with greater understanding of the patient's needs, not his condition, gives the patient the kind of a diagnosis he is willing to accept. If a physician insists on using the frontal attack and tells the patient that his trouble comes from his emotions, he must be prepared to follow up with an explanation of how the disease works to produce the patient's symptoms, what emotions are responsible for the patient's illness, and how the patient is to substitute better emotions for those he has been having. We call all this adequate psychotherapy. It is the only rational way we have had of treating emotionally induced illness. Drawbacks of adequate psychotherapy. But adequate psychotherapy, as it is understood today, is impossible because of time. The great obstacle to adequate psychotherapy is that it requires 20 hours per patient. Using it, a doctor could, by working 20 hours a day, treat the equivalent of one patient a day. But the average doctor in this country sees 23 patients a day. Suppose the general doctor were to send these patients to psychiatric specialists. I can hear some of you suggest that. Giving adequate psychotherapy to the tremendous number of patients with emotionally induced illness would require several 100,000 psychiatrists. There are only 5,000 at the present time in the United States. The problem of treating functional disease by adequate methods is thus obviously overwhelming. Less than 1% of the patients with emotionally induced illness receive adequate psychotherapy by present standards. Substitution therapy. The other 99% of the patients with emotionally induced illness received what might be termed substitution therapy. This consists of giving the patient a substitute diagnosis that he can readily understand to be a cause of his illness, and then carrying on the treatment ostensibly for that cause. This is psychotherapy too, but of a bastard variety. Such substitution therapy has been the accepted treatment for thousands of years. The primitive witch doctor told his functional patient he was possessed with evil spirits. The treatment consisted in driving out the evil spirits by very dramatic and suggestive methods. I sometimes wish, when I have a tough patient, that I had a method of therapy half as suggestive as the one the witch doctor used. The medieval doctor told his patient that he had an unbalance of the four humors, and then proceeded to remove one, usually blood, because that was the easiest to remove. The cultist of today tells his patient, "You have a vertebrae out of place," and then makes passes purporting to put it back into place. The modern physician uses modern substitute diagnoses such as high or low basal metabolic rate, high or low blood pressure, or adrenal cortical insufficiency. The last would make a hit in Park Avenue practice, but out in the grassroots country, a homely, sluggish liver would get across much better, and with much less fuss. Any good substitute diagnosis must be less severe than the disease the patient is afraid he had. Otherwise, the diagnosis merely makes the patient sicker. Substitution therapy has been possible through the ages because 60% of the patients treated by almost any variety of substitution therapy feel improved for a period of 2 months. A patient improved for 2 months is a good advertisement for the substitution therapist. New patients are sold by the temporary improvement. It has made possible such substitution therapeutic successes as the nostrums and quackeries, for which the public annually spends billions of dollars. It is the functionally ill who buy these items, along with the billions of dollars of vitamin preparations that swamp the national market. If the medical profession treated emotionally induced illness as effectively as it does lobar pneumonia, the quacks would be out of business overnight. This disease is the bread and butter of both the physician and the irregular healer. If adequate methods of treatment were to banish it altogether, the cults and the marginal, lower-grade physician would vanish from the scene. The worst feature of substitution therapy is that, in the long run, it makes the emotionally ill person worse and serves to cement the chronicity of the illness. Of the people treated by this method, only 8% are any better at the end of 1 year. The others have added the name of another disease to their fear that they are not well. And where the doctor is not wise and careful in his substitute diagnosis, he may give the patient a very severe phobia of a serious illness. This kind of doctor-started disease is known in the profession as an iatrogenic illness, meaning, in Greek, an illness started by a doctor. 3 out of every 5 emotionally ill patients one see in my office have an appreciable amount of iatrogenic illness, which makes treatment more difficult. Large-scale efforts are underway to develop more rapid and more adequate methods of treating this disease that can be used by the general physician. It is safe to say that another 20 years will see a complete revolution in the treatment of this. our most common disease. This present dark spot of modern medicine will become as brightly illuminated as the rest of the medical map. Emotionally induced illness is a physical disease. Let us distinctly understand that patients with this disease present themselves with physical symptoms, not mental symptoms. This is a difficult point for the uninitiated to grasp. The following is a partial list of the hundreds of symptoms this disease can produce. The percentage number after each symptom indicates how often its occurrence is due to emotionally induced illness. From this partial list, you can get the idea that the common things people complain of are emotionally induced. But anyone in medical practice can tell you that most of the uncommon, bizarre symptoms are also usually caused by emotional troubles. Complaint percentage: pain in the back of the neck 75, lump in the throat 90, ulcer-like pain 50, gallbladder-like pain 50, gas 9944/100, dizziness 80, constipation 70, tiredness 90. The more intelligent you are, the more you are prone to emotionally induced illness. Who do not understand the nature of the illness are apt to think that because of their own superior intelligence, they are immune to emotionally induced illness. As a matter of fact, emotionally induced illness, prevalent as one goes up the ladder of human responsibility, mental alertness, and capacity. This is probably because the alert mind can find 10 things to be worried and concerned about in the time the unalert mind can think of only one. The person with greater mental capacity also takes on greater responsibilities, which means, usually, more tense emotions. If intelligence actually consisted of being intelligent, it would include, before anything else, the intelligent orientation and handling of the emotions. But apparently, up to the present day, this ability has been pretty generally left out of being intelligent, and the so-styled intelligent people are usually the ones least capable of guiding their emotions through the maze of everyday living. The group in my part of the country who have emotionally induced illness least often are the farmers' wives with families of 9 or 10, who, in addition to their housework, also help out on the farm. Their minds are too busy with work to think, and they are too busy taking care of other people to think of themselves. One of these wonderful human beings told me one time, when I asked her whether she ever got tired, one of the most common functional symptoms. Son, 25 years ago, I taught myself never to ask myself that question. And that, incidentally, is the best cure for that kind of tiredness. William James' definition of an emotion: to understand emotionally induced illness, one must, of course, understand what an emotion is. In 1884, emotion was defined by William James as a state of mind that manifests itself by sensible changes in the body. With every emotion, and we are having some kind of an emotion every minute, changes are taking place in muscles, in blood vessels, in the viscera, in the endocrine glands. These changes and the perceptive mental state that accompanies them are the emotion. Without these bodily changes, there would be no emotion. 2 general kinds of emotions. Although there are some minor exceptions, all emotions belong in one of 2 groups as far as the changes they produce in the body are concerned. The first large group of emotions includes those whose changes consist in overstimulation of various parts of the body, and overstimulation, via the nervous system, of any organ or any muscle, overstimulation of one or more of the endocrine glands. Because these emotions overstimulate organs and muscles, they produce a feeling that is unpleasant. People for thousands of years have naturally called these the unpleasant emotions. These include such well-known ones as anger, anxiety, fear, apprehension, discouragement, grief, and dissatisfaction. Actually, there is no limit to the variety and nuance of emotions. One could make a list of unpleasant emotions a mile long. The second large group of emotions are those whose manifestations in the body are in optimal stimulation, one neither too extreme nor too weak. These are the emotions that we can lump together under the long-used term of pleasant emotions. We call them pleasant because the changes they produce give us a pleasant feeling. These are the emotions like hope, courage, joy, equanimity, affection, and agreeableness. Here again, the possible list is endless. There is no limit to their variety. Some of the manifestations of the emotion of anger let us see what the actual manifestations of a specific emotion are. We will take an emotion that you and I, of course, have never had, but that we have seen other people have the emotion of anger. In any emotion, there are external manifestations, that is, changes one can see exhibited externally on the surface of the body. These external manifestations make acting possible, for acting consists in duplicating the external manifestations of as many emotions as possible. A good actor can command many more than a poor actor. We can tell simply by looking at him whether he is portraying happiness, dissatisfaction, fear, and so on. The manifestations of the emotion of anger are so numerous that Dr. W. B. Cannon of Harvard University, who studied them in detail, required an entire printed page to merely list them. The chief external manifestations in the emotion of anger are a reddening of the skin of the face, a widening of the eyelids, bloodshot whites of the eyes, contraction and tightening of the lips, a setting of the jaw, clenching of the fists, a tremor in the arms, and very often a tremor in the voice. You know immediately on seeing anyone with such manifestations that he is in a state of anger. But the internal manifestations, that is, the changes that are occurring inside the body, are much more profound and remarkable. For example, when you become angry, your blood immediately clots quicker than normal, not just a little quicker, but a whole lot quicker. An emotion is a very fundamental biological change, and most of the manifestations are of some biological significance. Obviously, the blood-clotting change in anger serves a biological purpose. In the emotion of anger, one is very apt to have a fight, to receive a wound, and to bleed. It is then beneficial to have the blood clot quickly. Another similar biologically valuable manifestation is that the moment you become angry, the number of blood cells in the circulating blood increases by as much as 500,000 per cubic millimeter. When a person becomes angry, the muscles at the outlet of the stomach squeeze down so tightly that nothing leaves the stomach during anger, and the entire digestive tract becomes so spastic that many people have severe abdominal pains either during or after a fit of anger. The heart rate goes up markedly during anger, often to 180 or 220 or higher, and stays there until the anger has passed. The blood pressure rises markedly and steeply from a normal of 130 or so to 230 or more. This is a manifestation that often produces dire results. You have possibly known of a person who developed a stroke during a fit of anger because his blood pressure rose so high he blew a blood vessel in his brain. Also, in anger, the coronary arteries in the heart squeeze down, hard enough to produce angina pectoris, or even a fatal coronary occlusion. This happens fairly frequently. John Hunter, one of the greatest physiologists England ever had the uncomfortable combination of a ready temper and a bad set of coronary arteries. Hunter always said that the first rascal who really got him mad would kill him. His wife came close to finishing him a couple of times, but the rascal finally appeared at a medical meeting and made him so angry he dropped dead of a coronary occlusion. You can readily see how, if a man were angry enough at the time, the manifestations of his emotions might produce physical symptoms such as abdominal pain, exhausted heart, apoplexy, or a coronary occlusion. Fortunately, there are not very many men who are angry continually, although there are some. But we do find people, and many of them, who have some of the other unpleasant emotions continually. Examples of single emotions producing single symptoms. Let me give you two further examples that you have doubtless seen yourself, of how a single emotion can produce a single symptom. You have seen or heard of a person who faints when he looks at blood. He doesn't faint because he has a weak heart or a high blood pressure. He faints because the sight of blood produces the emotion of fear, and part of the manifestation of the emotion of fear is a squeezing down of some of the blood vessels supplying the brain. This produces the faint. In other people, the sight of blood may cause vomiting, not because they have a disease of the stomach, but because, in them, the sight of blood produces the emotion of disgust. Part of the manifestation of the emotion of disgust is a contraction of the stomach violent enough to cause vomiting. A single violent emotion may cause sudden, severe illness occasionally. A severe emotionally induced illness may follow one single severe emotion. A man was carried into our clinic one morning at 9 o'clock. He was carried in because he couldn't possibly have walked. He was too weak and too dizzy to stand. His heart was going 180 beats a minute. He was vomiting. He couldn't control his bowels. He couldn't control his urine. He stayed in that condition in the hospital for 3 months, during which time there were moments when we thought he couldn't live any longer. Until 8 o'clock that morning, this man had been a perfectly healthy and unusually strong man. At about 8 o'clock, he walked into his wife's bedroom and discovered that his wife had killed their only daughter and then committed suicide. From the time he made that discovery, he was a very sick man. It was not that he had acquired cancer or tuberculosis or heart trouble, although he was as ill as though he had developed all three. What he had developed was powerfully unpleasant emotions. Let's not forget this. Any one of the rest of us, with that man's mental background, in that man's situation, would have developed the same sort of violent illness. No one is immune to emotionally induced illness. Most emotionally induced illness comes from relatively small, unpleasant emotions. Most of the emotionally induced illness we physicians see in our offices does not come as the result of one large, terrific emotion, nor even from any series of catastrophes. Instead, most cases of emotionally induced illness are the result of a monotonous drip of seemingly unimportant, yet nevertheless unpleasant emotions. The everyday run of anxieties, fears, discouragements, and longings. Clinically, we've known this to be true for years. But a peculiar thing in medicine is that we never believe anything unless it can be demonstrated in animals. Monotonous repetition of unpleasant emotions. A few years ago, 2 Cornell psychologists, H.S. Liddell and A.V. Moore, demonstrated that the monotonous repetition of rather minor unpleasant emotions can produce emotionally induced illness, at least in sheep. These 2 investigators tied a light wire around one of the legs of one of the sheep, a wire so light that the sheep could carry it all about the field. At the end of a week of such wire pulling, the sheep was perfectly healthy and normal in every way. For the next week, small electric shocks were sent through the wire, not hard shocks, just light shocks, so that the sheep twitched its legs slightly with each shock. Doctors! Liddell and Moore could repeat this light shock as often as they pleased during the week. The sheep went right on eating in a perfectly normal fashion. Then the 2 investigators tried varying the stimuli, and they finally found that by introducing 2 other elements into the light shocks, they could produce a severe illness in any sheep in the field. The first element was the introduction of apprehension into the shocks. This they did by ringing a bell 10 seconds before they gave the shock. It was the same shock as before, not a bit stronger. But now when the sheep heard the bell, it stopped eating, or whatever it was doing, and waited apprehensively for the shock it soon learned was coming. But this new element alone was not enough to produce the disease. The second element was monotonous repetition of the bell shock apprehension. The interval of repetition did not make much difference as long as it was monotonously repeated. With this kind of treatment, every sheep it was tried upon soon showed signs of illness. It would first quit eating. Then it would stop following its companions around the field. Next, it quit walking. Then it failed to stay on its feet. Finally, it began to have difficulty in breathing. Then the experiment had to be stopped, or the sheep would have died. Once the monotonous repetition of apprehension was stopped, the sheep soon returned to normal. The effect of interrupting monotonous apprehension. A most interesting and important secondary finding made by doctors. Little and more in their experiments on the sheep was that if the monotonous repetition of apprehension was interrupted for a period of 2 hours in every 24, none of H.S. Liddell, The Neurotic Animals of Ithaca, N.Y. Science Illustrated, February 1949, 4-2 p. 26. The sheep would develop functional illness. A rest period less than 2 hours was ineffective. It is thus apparent that to get emotionally induced illness, the monotonous repetition of unpleasant emotions must be almost constant. To interrupt the stream completely each day would effectively prevent the disease. However, we do meet exceptional cases where an emotionally induced illness arises from a single precipitating event. These are always interesting and valuable in understanding and appreciating the profound nature of the illness. In addition to the case of the man whose wife committed suicide, another interesting example comes to mind. The superintendent of schools in a neighboring city was a level-headed, well-adjusted individual who seemed as little likely to develop emotionally induced illness as anyone you could name. Then one day he developed a severe dizziness that could be relieved only by lying down. Just as soon as he attempted to sit upright, he became intensely dizzy and had to vomit. He was taken home and put to bed. There he stayed for many days, not improving. Nothing his physician gave him made him the least bit better. Then one day, as if by magic, he was better and returned to school. Some days afterward, he went to his physician and said, "I wouldn't have thought that I could have emotions that would make me sick. But I am absolutely certain the illness I had was caused by a distressing series of emotions." "What makes you say that?" asked his doctor. "Some time ago, one of my best friends in the city asked me to back him up on a loan of a considerable sum of money. It was such a large loan that I hesitated signing his note, since I knew that if the man failed to pay the note, it would completely wipe me out of house and savings. Yet it seemed safe enough, and since the man was a good friend, I could not refuse. So I signed. It wasn't long after that. The man was seriously hurt in an accident and spent months in the hospital, during which time it looked more and more as though his business venture was going to the wall. Worrying about that brought on my dizziness." "But how can you be sure about that?" asked the doctor. "Well, sir," went on the superintendent, "when I was in bed, feeling my sickest, this friend of mine for whom I had signed the note came to visit me, and told me that he had just been over to the bank and had paid off the note in full. From that moment, I started to recover. The next day, I went back to school." The production of symptoms in emotionally induced illness emotions manifest themselves through 2 different systems in the body. Some of the manifestations are mediated through the nervous system, others through the endocrine glands. Some of the symptoms can be produced either by way of the nervous system or by way of the endocrine system. CHAPTER1 INANUTSHELL when you, or I, or any one of us, has a physical illness, the chances are better than 50% that our illness is emotionally induced. Emotionally induced illness is a physical, not a mental disease. It produces thousands of symptoms, varying from such homely ones as pain in the neck and gas, to such complicated ones as nephrosclerosis and peptic ulcer. An emotion consists of chemical and physical changes in the body, either on the face, where they may be seen by others, or internally, where they are felt by us, changes that are the feeling of every thought we think. In the emotion of anger, the physical changes on the face spell anger. One of the internal changes in anger is an increase of blood pressure that sometimes breaks a cerebral blood vessel and produces a stroke. Another internal change that takes place in anger is a narrowing of the coronary blood vessels of the heart. This sometimes produces a coronary death. The so-called unpleasant emotions are the ones whose internal changes produce the symptoms of disease. The pleasant emotions produce changes that make us feel good. That is to say, they are optional changes. The chemical and physical changes in the body, which are the emotions, are mediated from the brain through the 1. Autonomic nervous system and through the 2. Endocrine glands.
How your emotions produce illness through your nervous system. The manifestations of emotions mediated through the nervous system. The portion of the nervous system concerned with the emotions is the part called the autonomic nervous system. It is outside the control of the will. The brain center of the autonomic nervous system is the hypothalamus, which is also the center for pituitary gland stimulation. We shall see later that the pituitary gland is a more powerful agent for manifesting emotions than even the autonomic nervous system. Muscle tension and the production of pain-tense muscles are one of the most common sources of the general aches and pains we experience more or less constantly. The intense pain produced by a cramp illustrates very well how very severe muscle pains can be. If you will make a fist of your hand, not tightly, but firmly, you will find that it produces no pain at first. After a while, however, the muscle tension involved in making a fist begins to hurt more and more intensely. The unpleasant emotions are commonly manifested by tightness, both in the skeletal muscles and the muscles of the internal organs. If these muscle-tensing emotions are continued long enough, or if they are monotonously repeated, the muscles involved begin to hurt. So-and-so gives me a pain in the neck. The muscle groups most commonly involved in emotional manifestation are the muscles most commonly used. The muscles at the back of the neck, which are used more than any other set of skeletal muscles, are such a group. These same neck muscles are common sites of tense emotional manifestation. 85% of the patients complaining of a pain in the back of the head, radiating down the neck, have their pain as a result of emotional tightness in these muscles. This tension origin of neck pain was recognized years ago by that wise practical physiologist who first remarked that, "So and so gives me a pain in the neck." Such a statement is literally true. To demonstrate to yourself how emotions can tighten the muscles at the back of the neck, seat yourself in an easy chair tonight, and then worry hard about something for an hour. When you get up, you will twist and stretch your neck because it feels tight, and the chances are that it will hurt. The common lump in the throat another folks saying is, "I was so scared that my heart came up into my throat." More commonly, patients complain of a lump in the throat. All the while, naturally, they are afraid they have some sort of a growth. Actually, what 95% of these patients have is an emotional tightness of the muscles at the upper end of the esophagus. This tightness feels like a lump. If the individual tries to swallow when these muscles are tight, there is a moment's hesitancy before the muscles loosen up, and the person feels as though he is choking. Then he becomes doubly sure there is something dreadfully wrong in his throat, and the lump becomes twice as bothersome. Cardiospasm, or emotional tightness of the lower end of the esophagus. The muscles at the lower end of the esophagus enter into emotional manifestation much less commonly than do the muscles at the upper end, and fortunately so. for when the lower esophageal muscles squeeze down, they are apt to stay squoze for days or even weeks, during which time nothing will run into the stomach, not even water. Such an individual would slowly starve if something were not done for him. Emotional manifestation in the muscles of the stomach. The stomach is one of the organs par excellence for the manifestation of emotions. The emotional activities of the stomach are felt by everyone every day. When our worlds are going along well, we have a good appetite because the stomach is manifesting pleasant emotions. However, when things do not go well, we suddenly find that we have entirely lost our appetites. If then something good should happen, if an unknown uncle should leave us a cool million whoopee, right away our appetite is back. When the muscles of our stomachs tighten because of a certain variety of emotions, the resulting feeling is that of a lump in our upper abdomen. Some people describe it as a stone. When the stomach muscles squeeze down really hard, a pain is produced, sometimes a very severe one. This pain often bears a considerable resemblance to the pain produced by an ulcer. We will see, in the next chapter, how ulcers are produced by the emotions, but we are speaking now of a muscle pain, not an ulcer pain. Fully 50% of the patients who complain of an ulcer-like pain are found not to have an ulcer, but merely an emotional muscle pain of the stomach. That the two pains resemble one another can be understood when one knows that even if one has an ulcer, it is not the ulcer that hurts, but the contraction of muscles next to the ulcer. A painfully contracting muscle will feel the same whether an ulcer or an emotion is producing the spasm. Some time ago, I had as a patient a grocer who had an emotionally induced pain in his stomach. Being in competition with chain stores is a source of trouble sufficient to give one an emotional stomach pain. But that wasn't all the trouble this poor fellow had. I'm sure that if I had had the man's wife, I would have had all his pain. And even that wasn't all. He also had a son who was always getting into trouble. Not just a little trouble, but a whole lot of trouble. And between his grocery, his wife, and his son, this poor grocer had a pain in his stomach most of the time. And of course, every once in a while, some consultant would tell him that he had an ulcer. Then the thing really hurt. Whenever he went to doctors who knew what they were talking about, he was told that he had no ulcer. That didn't help his pain much, because he was only made more confused, and that gave him pain. But finally, he began to believe that he had no ulcer. Every time he went to northern Wisconsin for fishing, which he did twice a year, all he had to do was to get to Belleville, a town 25 miles north of his home, and there, on the main street of Belleville, his pain stopped. It did not return again until 2 weeks later, when, on his way home, he came to Round Grove Hill and caught sight of the courthouse tower in his hometown. There his pain started again. At the Mayo Clinic, there used to be a famous doctor who had the same kind of pain. He knew what his pain was, but he said that as long as he was in Rochester with patients pushing and pulling him, and with many things on his mind, he would have his pain almost all the time. To get rid of the pain, all he had to do was to get on the train, and when the train came to when the train came to the center of the bridge crossing the Mississippi, the pain left, not to return until the train again pulled into the Rochester station, and he looked out to see the clinic tower. The doctor's analysis of why the pain left in the center of the bridge was this: that was where the train left Minnesota, and he never had liked Minnesota. My grocer patient said that he had always admired Belleville. In fact, he had always wanted to live there. And when he reached its main street, he had a feeling of well-being for the first time in weeks. That was where his pain stopped. The colon is the mirror of the mind. The same kind of painful spasm can occur, and does occur, in the 28 feet of intestine that lie beyond the stomach, but most especially in the part known as the colon. The colon, more than any other organ, is a manifester of the emotions. So much so that a wise doctor in Philadelphia remarked some years ago that the colon is the mirror of the mind, and when the mind gets tight, the colon gets tight. One of the most remarkable things about emotional manifestation is illustrated by the colon, and I wish to call your attention to it here. In any given individual, the same emotion will be manifested in the same way every time it occurs. If, in one individual, the muscles at the back of the neck squeeze down every time he gets anxious, these same muscles will always act the same with the same emotion. In some other individual, it may be a 3-inch segment of the colon that squeezes down hard with a similar emotion, and it will always be the same 3-inch segment that responds to the emotion. If this spasm happens to be in the colon in the upper right-hand portion of the abdomen, it will produce a pain very similar to a gallstone colic. 50% of the people we see with fairly typical gallbladder attacks turn out to have normal gallbladders. They are having their attacks from emotional spasm of their colon or some other adjacent muscle. Dr. Andrew C. Ivy, Chicago physiologist, showed that an emotional spasm of the small sphincter muscle at the bile duct outlet can also produce a pain as severe as any gallbladder attack. Emotionally induced gallbladder-like pain. Probably every doctor has at some time mistaken an emotional colon spasm for a gallbladder attack. I admit I have. I was called to see a patient who had all the symptoms and findings of a very severe gallbladder colic. Any other doctor seeing her that day would have made the same diagnosis. I had to give her 3 hypos before the pain finally abated. I paid too little attention to the fact that the patient's only son had received notice of the draft only 2 days before. 2 days after her son had left for an army camp, the lady had a second and similar attack, which again had all the earmarks of gallbladder disease. Again, 3 hypos. The third and most severe attack occurred 3 months later, 2 days after the patient had received word that her son had left New York City for overseas, destination not announced. On that occasion, the patient was so very ill that I had to move her to the hospital. When gallbladder x-rays were taken, I was surprised to find a normal gallbladder. Nevertheless, I felt so certain that the gallbladder contained stones invisible to x-rays that I advised operative removal of the gallbladder. This the patient agreed to, and the gallbladder was removed. Following this, the patient did well for many months. I was about ready to regard myself as a remarkably clever fellow when the lady had her 4th severe attack of right upper quadrant pain, this time without benefit of the gallbladder. This attack occurred 2 days after she had received word that her son had landed in North Africa, and the papers carried the news that fighting had started with the Germans. A 5th attack occurred when she learned that her son had been wounded. Following this, the boy returned home and the lady has had no spells since. Emotional appendicitis. If the emotional spasm of the colon occurs in the right lower quadrant of the abdomen, it will look for all the world like an attack of appendicitis. Even a very smart doctor may be unable to make a positive diagnosis, especially in children in whom this kind of thing is especially apt to occur. Very often, to be safe, the surgeon will open the abdomen, only to find a normal appendix and a bowel squeezed down so tight that it is blanched white. In other people, painful spasms may occur throughout the entire length of the colon, and believe me, these people are intensely uncomfortable. There are so many emotional disturbances of the colon that all sort of terms have been evolved for them, like spastic colon, irritable colon, non-specific ulcerative colitis, and many other terms, all of them merely synonyms for emotional colon. Gas. One of the commonest complaints people have is of gas and bloating. Doctor, they will say, everything I eat goes to gas. Doctor, I blowed up something terrible. Or, when this gas forms, it crowds my heart. One patient even said that her gas, which came from her food, went up through her chest, through her neck, and whistled out through her ear. It always surprises these patients, as it did me when I first heard it, to hear that not even a little bit of gas is formed in the process of our digestion. All the gas that we get in our stomachs and intestines is swallowed when we eat our food or swallow our saliva. The thing that is happening when we have gas or bloating is that one or more of the 3-inch segments of the small bowel is squeezing down tightly. These spasms are so tight that they produce temporary obstructions through which nothing can pass. These spastic obstructions may last from 5 to 60 minutes, or even longer. The liquid and gaseous content of the intestine is carried up against this obstruction by the normal peristalsis of the bowel, and the intestine, consequently, balloons up. The victim feels this ballooning or bloating along with the spasm as a very disagreeable feeling. When the spasm is finally rather suddenly relieved, the contents of the ballooned bowel shoots ahead with an angry gurgle which one can feel and often hear. With this relief of pressure, the individual says to himself, "There goes my gas." That, my dyspeptic friend, is what gas is. Under the X-ray fluoroscope, I have viewed as many as 18 or 20 such spasms occurring at the same time in the same person. Believe me, he was an uncomfortable human, and he wasn't imagining it. To our patients suffering with gas, we show colored photographs of an open abdomen on an operating table. The patient photographed was a young man with a considerable police record. For certain medical reasons, his abdominal operation was performed under local anesthesia so that only his abdominal wall was anesthetized. When the abdomen had been opened, the small intestines and colon were in full view and appeared normal. The first picture was made. Then the surgeon said to the patient, "Have you had any encounters with the police lately?" And knowing full well that the police were waiting for the fellow at the front door as soon as he was dismissed from the hospital. Within a minute, several visible spasms formed in the small bowel with typical ballooning behind the spasm. Then the second picture was taken. The surgeon asked, "How do you feel now?" The young man answered, "I'm all bloated." From the emotions too, stem most belches. Belching is very much the same thing, except that it occurs in the stomach. I don't, of course, mean the lusty animal belch that escapes after a big meal or a glass of beer, but the more embarrassing belching you see many people struggle with whenever they become disturbed or under pressure. I know a very good public speaker who, during his first 10 minutes of feeling out his audience, struggles with himself, often unsuccessfully, to hold down the belches. Once he finds himself and hits his stride, he leaves his belches behind. I'll never forget a patient I saw in 1942. The poor miserable man was belching at a constant rate of once every 30 seconds. He did this whether he was at home, at church, or in my office. And it had been going on for a week. Believe me, he wanted to get rid of it. Nothing he had tried had helped in the least. One surgeon had advised cutting the phrenic nerves to immobilize the diaphragm. Here is how his belching started. In the spring of 1942, he had sold his farm and bought a bakery, a business entirely new to him. In 1942, you will remember, sugar, flour, lard, all the ingredients he needed in his bakery were strictly rationed. The poor chap was as poor at arithmetic as he was at the bakery business, and very soon he was in such difficulties with the local rationing board that the federal agents were being called in. Just at this time his consternation became abysmal because his baker, on whom he absolutely depended, was called by the draft. The poor owner started to do what you and I would probably also have done under the circumstances. He started to belch. There was obviously only one treatment. That was to sell his bakery and get out. When this was suggested, the poor man smiled for the first time in our acquaintance. 12 hours after the sale was consummated, the man quit belching, to his infinite relief. Be choosy. If you must have bad emotions, you see what problems the emotions that manifest themselves in the digestive tract can produce. If you must have them, therefore, try to pick out an emotion which manifests itself in the left side of your colon. There are fewer emergency operations possible on that side. Emotional manifestations in the muscles of the blood vessels. So far, we have dealt with symptoms produced by emotional manifestation in the muscles of the digestive tract. But all the other muscles of the body are influenced by the emotions, especially the muscles that are to be found in the walls of all, but the very smallest blood vessels. One of the more obvious and common emotional responses of the blood vessels is blushing. But there are many others. The moderate-sized blood vessels, lying inside or outside the skull, are highly sensitive to emotional stimuli. As these vessels contract emotionally, headache is produced, both the common type of headache or the more severe type we know as migraine. Fully 85% of all headaches are emotionally induced. In some individuals, the causal connection between the emotional disturbance and the headache is clearly evident. But sometimes it is not so apparent. The emotional excitant may be some deeply seated trouble which the person may try to hide even from himself, one he certainly would not tell anyone else even if he could. But the emotions behind most headaches are easy enough to spot. For example, one of my patients developed a terrific migraine that kept her in bed for a day every time she went to town. She was a fastidious housekeeper living on a farm. Going to town meant getting her house in spick and span condition, getting the children cleaned and dressed, thinking of what she had to do in town, and becoming apprehensive about meeting people because she was very shy. By the time she started for town, her headache had started, and when she returned home, she would have to go to bed. The cure for her headaches was obvious: not to go to town. She does, of course, occasionally. Sometimes it is to see her doctor. She goes home with her headache. Emotionally induced skin trouble. But blood vessels manifesting emotions can do even more remarkable things. Fully 30% of the skin trouble in these United States is what the dermatologists call neurodermatitis. A neurodermatitis can occur anywhere on the body. In the skin involved, the small blood vessels in the second layer are constantly squeezing down in emotional manifestation. Every time they do so, a small amount of serum is extruded through the thin layer of the vessel. As this continues, an appreciable amount of serum accumulates in the tissues. First, the skin gets slightly brawny, then red. Soon there is enough serum under pressure to force its way to the surface, and one has the weeping, scaling, crusting, and itching of a full-blown case of neurodermatitis. One of my patients was a man of 73 with a terrific generalized neurodermatitis, which he had had for some years. He had never had any skin disease until he was 68. At 67, his first wife died, and at 68, he married his second wife, a lady of his own age. It was on their honeymoon that he first developed his dermatitis, and when they got home, it was so severe that he soon had to be hospitalized. After a week in the hospital, the skin would be very much better, and he would return home, only to have the whole thing recur a short time later. In the course of time, he had to go to a town several hundred miles away on business. After being there a week, his neurodermatitis cleared up. The next time it became bad again at home, he returned to Moline because it was cheaper than going to the hospital. Some time later, he went to another distant town on business and found that there too his dermatitis cleared up in a week. Finally, his wife had to leave home to care for a sick relative, and our patient stayed home alone, and lo and behold, after a week, his skin was clear. The connection had become obvious enough. We asked him, "What did you discover about your wife during your honeymoon?" He had the answer ready immediately. "I found out that she was domineering and dominating, and I just can't stand it." We then took his wife aside and explained to her that she was causing her husband's dermatitis. She didn't like to believe it, but she promised that she would lean over backwards, trying not to be domineering. She performed admirably, and the man's neurodermatitis left completely. Occasionally, there is a hint of return, and then we simply talk to the wife once more. Emotional manifestation in skeletal muscles. We saw earlier in this chapter how tightening of the neck muscles caused our most common neck pain. It was learned by careful study during World War II that the thing we have called muscular rheumatism, or myofibrosis or fibrositis, is almost invariably produced by emotional tension. During the First World War, a certain percentage of the boys in the trenches developed fibrositis. It was thought to be due to the wet, miserable, and exposed living conditions in the trenches. But in the Second World War, almost exactly the same percentage of the boys in the battle line developed fibrositis. The percentage was the same whether they were fighting in the cold, wet Aleutian Islands or in hot, dry North Africa. It was found, furthermore, that the incidence of fibrositis increased steadily as the boys moved forward from the base camps toward the fighting front. And it was eventually determined that an emotion was responsible, the emotion a person has when he is called upon to do something he would not do if compulsion were not upon him. In this situation, he involuntarily steels himself and tightens certain muscles, very often those of the shoulder girdle. This also occurs, of course, in individuals in civilian life who must constantly meet situations they would rather avoid. If such situations are acute enough, or if they are of long enough duration, pain is eventually produced. One of the common sites of such pain is the pectoral muscle of the left chest. The same thing, of course, can occur in the pectoral muscle of the right chest. But a person pays much more attention to a pain in the left chest than one in the right, and becomes much more alarmed, because he fears more and more, as the pain goes on, that he has heart disease. All he needs, then, is for some uncertain doctor to murmur that, "You might have a little heart trouble," and he is off on a long emotionally induced and physician-augmented illness. Fibrositis is an exceedingly common cause of pain in human beings. Most people will get a fibrositis at some time or other, and some people are subject to fibrositis all the time. I happen to be one of the latter. I have a fibrositis most of the time. And of course, it is emotionally induced. Every day I am compelled to see more people in my office than a doctor ought to see. So many that seeing them thoroughly constitutes severe physical and emotional pressure. So I am hurting somewhere most of the time, especially if the irate relatives of a particularly sick patient camp on my trail. When I leave on a vacation, my fibrositis stays behind in my office. When I get back to my office, I put it on again. Right now, for instance, I have a fibrositis in my right shoulder area, so severe that I can't push a screen door open. The important thing is that I recognize properly what my pain is and what its source is. Then I don't worry about it. Many other people who do not have the fortune to be doctors worry about their fibrositis. They fear, perhaps, they are filled to the brim with cancer, or they believe they have crippling rheumatism, and apprehensively expect to be crippled and incapacitated. Nothing could be further from the truth. Fibrositis never becomes crippling. It becomes incapacitating only if you let it. It is not serious. It merely belongs in the class of confounded nuisances. Most of us hurt somewhere almost all the time. I must deviate here just a moment to call attention to a very important point that, when it is unrealized, is apt to start many people on the long, hard road of bellyaching. If at any time on a busy day, we stop and ask ourselves, where do I hurt? We can usually find a pain somewhere, perhaps in a foot, perhaps in the lower abdomen. Sometimes, out of nowhere, there will come a very severe momentary pain, perhaps in the thigh, perhaps in the chest, a pain severe enough to make us pause a moment in our hectic flight. Such pains are part of the normal processes of living. For no explainable reason, a pain nerve ending is being stimulated, or a blood vessel is contracting painfully, or a muscle bundle is cramping. Some people feel these pains more readily than others because their threshold to pain sensations is lower than other people's. The late Dr. E. Liebman, of New York City, one of America's great physicians some years ago, called attention to the fact that some people are more susceptible to pain than other people, not because they are bigger babies, but simply because they feel pain more readily. He devised a simple clinical test to tell how sensitive to pain a person is. It consists in pressing against the styloid process, which lies just below the lobe of the ear, behind the angle of the jaw. A non-sensitive person will not wince when the styloid process is pressed, whereas a person who is sensitive to pain will draw away and make an awful grimace. A person who is very sensitive to pain will feel the normal peristaltic contractions of his intestines as a pain. I am italicizing that sentence because it explains why some people have a continual discomfort or pain in their abdomens. Unless they appreciate their sensitiveness to pain and realize the cause of their abdominal pain, these people will be chronically ill all their lives, and the victims of all the organically minded physicians in the country. Anyone feeling one of the common pains all of us experience every day can work it up into quite a major experience if he puts all his attention and awareness into it. To make such a minimal pain worse, all one needs to do is to center one's awareness upon it. It will begin to perform for him, growing bolder and more magnificent until it can be worked up into quite a thing. Another factor that will magnify and aggravate any minimal pain is the development of any tension state. It has been shown in a number of different ways that an anxiety state lowers the threshold of pain. Sensations that we would term mildly painful, or that we would overlook altogether when we are in a happy state, will become very painful at times when we are emotionally distressed. It is partly for this reason that so many people develop low backaches when they are under emotional tension. Everyone experiences a low backache at some time or other. Usually, after a bit of muscle strain, it may be so mild that one pays no attention to it. But during emotional stress, the threshold of pain becomes so lowered that the painful stimuli in the back are highly magnified. You have read only a very partial list of emotional muscular symptoms in this chapter. I have listed a few of the commoner and the more interesting symptoms produced by emotional manifestation in the muscles. There are as many more as there are muscles in the body and organs that contain muscles. It would be too time-consuming and too boring for you if I listed them all. I simply wish to give you an idea of how our emotions, your emotions, work to produce illness. If we realize that this is true, that it is true in ourselves, then we do not need to feel apprehensive over most of the discomforts we feel in ourselves. By realizing this, we will have made the first great step, and the most important one, in avoiding the disease that is causing more morbidity, more disability, more misery, more absenteeism, and more accidents than all the other diseases this human clay can contract. Certainly this is important, primarily important, to every one of us. Emotional manifestation in skeletal muscles. We saw earlier in this chapter how tightening of the neck muscles caused our most common neck pain. It was learned by careful study during World War II that the thing we have called muscular rheumatism, or myofibrosis or fibrositis, is almost invariably produced by emotional tension. During the First World War, a certain percentage of the boys in the trenches developed fibrositis. It was thought to be due to the wet, miserable, and exposed living conditions in the trenches. But in the Second World War, almost exactly the same percentage of the boys in the battle line developed fibrositis. The percentage was the same whether they were fighting in the cold, wet Aleutian Islands or in hot, dry North Africa. It was found, furthermore, that the incidence of fibrositis increased steadily as the boys moved forward from the base camps toward the fighting front. And it was eventually determined that an emotion was responsible, the emotion a person has when he is called upon to do something he would not do if compulsion were not upon him. In this situation, he involuntarily steels himself and tightens certain muscles, very often those of the shoulder girdle. This also occurs, of course, in individuals in civilian life who must constantly meet situations they would rather avoid. If such situations are acute enough, or if they are of long enough duration, pain is eventually produced. One of the common sites of such pain is the pectoral muscle of the left chest. The same thing, of course, can occur in the pectoral muscle of the right chest. But a person pays much more attention to a pain in the left chest than one in the right, and becomes much more alarmed, because he fears more and more, as the pain goes on, that he has heart disease. All he needs, then, is for some uncertain doctor to murmur that you might have a little heart trouble, and he is off on a long emotionally induced and physician-augmented illness. Fibrositis is an exceedingly common cause of pain in human beings. Most people will get a fibrositis at some time or other, and some people are subject to fibrositis all the time. I happen to be one of the latter. I have a fibrositis most of the time. And of course, it is emotionally induced. Every day I am compelled to see more people in my office than a doctor ought to see, so many that seeing them thoroughly constitutes severe physical and emotional pressure. So I am hurting somewhere most of the time, especially if the irate relatives of a particularly sick patient camp on my trail. When I leave on a vacation, my fibrositis stays behind in my office. When I get back to my office, I put it on again. Right now, for instance, I have a fibrositis in my right shoulder area, so severe that I can't push a screen door open. The important thing is that I recognize properly what my pain is and what its source is. Then I don't worry about it. Many other people who do not have the fortune to be doctors worry about their fibrositis. They fear, perhaps, they are filled to the brim with cancer, or they believe they have crippling rheumatism and apprehensively expect to be crippled and incapacitated. Nothing could be further from the truth. Fibrositis never becomes crippling. It becomes incapacitating only if you let it. It is not serious. It merely belongs in the class of confounded nuisances. Most of us hurt somewhere almost all the time. I must deviate here just a moment to call attention to a very important point that, when it is unrealized, is apt to start many people on the long, hard road of bellyaching. If at any time on a busy day we stop and ask ourselves, where do I hurt? We can usually find a pain somewhere, perhaps in a foot, perhaps in the lower abdomen. Sometimes, out of nowhere, there will come a very severe momentary pain, perhaps in the thigh, perhaps in the chest, a pain severe enough to make us pause a moment in our hectic flight. Such pains are part of the normal processes of living. For no explainable reason, a pain nerve ending is being stimulated, or a blood vessel is contracting painfully, or a muscle bundle is cramping. Some people feel these pains more readily than others because their threshold to pain sensations is lower than other people's. The late Dr. E. Liebman, of New York City, one of America's great physicians some years ago, called attention to the fact that some people are more susceptible to pain than other people, not because they are bigger babies, but simply because they feel pain more readily. He devised a simple clinical test to tell how sensitive to pain a person is. It consists in pressing against the styloid process, which lies just below the lobe of the ear, behind the angle of the jaw. A non-sensitive person will not wince when the styloid process is pressed, whereas a person who is sensitive to pain will draw away and make an awful grimace. A person who is very sensitive to pain will feel the normal peristaltic contractions of his intestines as a pain. I am italicizing that sentence because it explains why some people have a continual discomfort or pain in their abdomens. Unless they appreciate their sensitiveness to pain and realize the cause of their abdominal pain, these people will be chronically ill all their lives, and the victims of all the organically minded physicians in the country. Anyone feeling one of the common pains all of us experience every day can work it up into quite a major experience if he puts all his attention and awareness into it. To make such a minimal pain worse, all one needs to do is to center one's awareness upon it. It will begin to perform for him, growing bolder and more magnificent until it can be worked up into quite a thing. Another factor that will magnify and aggravate any minimal pain is the development of any tension state. It has been shown in a number of different ways that an anxiety state lowers the threshold of pain. Sensations that we would term mildly painful, or that we would overlook altogether when we are in a happy state, will become very painful at times when we are emotionally distressed. It is partly for this reason that so many people develop low backaches when they are under emotional tension. Everyone experiences a low backache at some time or other. Usually, after a bit of muscle strain, it may be so mild that one pays no attention to it. But during emotional stress, the threshold of pain becomes so lowered that the painful stimuli in the back are highly magnified. You have read only a very partial list of emotional muscular symptoms in this chapter. I have listed a few of the commoner and the more interesting symptoms produced by emotional manifestation in the muscles. There are as many more as there are muscles in the body and organs that contain muscles. It would be too time-consuming and too boring for you if I listed them all. I simply wish to give you an idea of how our emotions, your emotions, work to produce illness. If we realize that this is true, that it is true in ourselves, then we do not need to feel apprehensive over most of the discomforts we feel in ourselves. By realizing this, we will have made the first great step, and the most important one, in avoiding the disease that is causing more morbidity, more disability, more misery, more absenteeism, and more accidents than all the other diseases this human clay can contract. Certainly this is important, primarily important, to every one of us. Brief summary of Chapter 2. The emotional effects produced through the autonomic nervous system are less severe than those produced through the endocrine glands, but they are more common and just as disagreeable. A common nerve effect is a tight muscle. A tight muscle is painful, whether it is in a leg, in a blood vessel wall, or in the stomach. Thus, emotionally tight muscles produce pain in the back of the neck, in the stomach, in the colon, in the scalp, in blood vessels, in skeletal muscles. Emotionally tight muscles produce ulcer-like pains, gallbladder-like pains, common headaches, migraine headaches, and a great host of clinical pictures. Another blood vessel effect is neurodermatitis, which constitutes 30% of all skin disease. The phenomenon that we ordinarily term gas is in reality an emotional spasm of muscles in the small intestines. Most belches are emotional muscle effects in the stomach. How emotional overbreathing affects you. We all hyperventilate at times. There is one set of symptoms, emotionally induced, that is especially common, and that produces severe apprehension in the people who experience it. This set of symptoms is known medically as the hyperventilation syndrome. It is of interest historically, since it was the first syndrome known to be emotionally induced in which a chemical factor plays a leading role. The chance is that you too have experienced the hyperventilation syndrome at some time or other. By hyperventilation, we simply mean breathing too deeply or too fast or both. You have noticed that if you become acutely disturbed, you will breathe faster than usual. Actors whose art consists mainly in portraying the external manifestations of emotions do the same on the stage. Normally, most of us breathe between 16 and 18 times a minute at rest. If we were to increase our rate to 22 or 23 times a minute, we ourselves, or those near us, would probably not notice the difference, but our bodies would soon notice the increase, in ways we will describe in a moment. What happens when you hyperventilate? When we breathe faster than normal, more carbon dioxide is being lost from the blood through the lungs than is being formed in the body. Consequently, the level of carbon dioxide in the blood gradually drops to a point at which things begin to happen. About the first thing that happens is a crawling sensation under the skin. Next, there is a perceptible numbness of the fingers, hands, and other parts of the body, gradually becoming more pronounced, until finally there is a sensation of needles pricking the skin all over. But long before the numbness becomes as acute as that, other symptoms appear. The heart starts to race. There is a trembling feeling at first inside, and later all over the body. Lightheadedness, or even fainting, occurs. Finally, cramps appear increasingly hard until it seems that every skeletal muscle is cramping. The legs and arms draw up in a painful spastic position, known as tetany. We have patients who, when they are upset, will go through the entire gamut of hyperventilation and end up in tetany. A farmer, for instance, called up excitedly one day because his son had just fallen out of the haymow. I hurried out to his farm, and on arriving there, I found the father lying on the floor in tetany because he had hyperventilated so hard in his excitement. He needed attention more than did the son who had fallen out of the haymow. This man had these hyperventilation episodes ever so often. One day, a dentist in town called me to come immediately to his office because this same farmer was having, the dentist said, a fit. But I found him lying on the floor in tetany. He had been so apprehensive all day about going to the dentist that he had been hyperventilating. The payoff came in the dentist's chair. In other patients, some of the other symptoms of hyperventilation stand out more prominently than the cramps. It is quite common to find a terrified patient with the sensation of 1,000 needles all over him and his heart beating wildly. He is naturally terrified because if he ever felt as though he were going to die, it is at that moment. Other patients will become very lightheaded or may faint during or after hyperventilation. One young lady had not been able to get out of bed for 2 months because she hyperventilated so constantly that she fainted as soon as she tried to stand. Hyperventilation is common during sleep. One of the most interesting things about hyperventilation is that it occurs most commonly in our sleep. If you will watch a sleeping person, especially someone who is in a troublesome life situation, you will see him breathe more rapidly and deeply for a time, and then lapse into quiet breathing, only to repeat the whole cycle over again. Our minds are never at rest. We are dreaming every minute of the night, And at night in our sleep, the usual censor, common sense, is not around. If someone on our street says something nasty to disturb us during the day, at night in our dreams that person, at the head of a band of Indians, is probably chasing us toward a precipitous cliff. In our sleep, we react emotionally as though we really were being driven toward catastrophe. We roll and toss, and we hyperventilate. About once every week during my 20 years of medical practice, I have had to see someone about 2:00 a.m. who awoke during hyperventilation, probably just at the point where he was about to be hurled over the cliff. When he awakens, the stage of hyperventilation is usually at the point where his heart is racing and his hands are numb. Naturally, he thinks he is dying of heart trouble. One such call came from a distance of 15 miles. The husband yelled into the phone, "My wife is dying of a heart attack. Come quick." I knew them both, and I would have given odds of 10 to 1 that she was hyperventilating. When I arrived, I was glad I had gone, because both husband and wife had hyperventilated to the point of tetany and needed medical relief in the worst sort of way. This is what had happened. The wife had awakened from sleep to find her hands numb and her heart beating wildly. Her first thought was, "I am having a stroke like my mother had." She awakened her husband and told him how she felt. His first thought was, "My wife is having a heart attack like my father had." They then both got more excited and continued to hyperventilate. To their surprise, they lived. At other times, a person may not awaken until hyperventilation has produced cramps in the legs. This is a common cause of leg cramps at night, a condition which can be prevented rather simply by an inexpensive pill. The gist of Chapter 3. A person under stress is likely to hyperventilate, that is, breathe more rapidly than normal, without being aware of it. In doing so, he breathes out enough carbon dioxide to lower the level of carbon dioxide in the blood. As this blood level of carbon dioxide drops, the person experiences numbness, tingling, rapid heart action, internal quivering, fainting, weakness, and cramps. He may experience all of them, or some more prominently than others. Since hyperventilation is apt to occur with the emotions produced by the dreams in our sleep, we often awaken feeling some of the symptoms of hyperventilation. And if we don't know what they are, we are apt to fear impending disaster. How your emotions produce disease through your glands. It's not your nerves. Doctors and people knew for a long time that the nervous system had, in some way, a great deal to do with emotionally induced illness. Remarks such as these are common. "It's your nerves. I'm all nerves. If I could only do something about my nerves. My nerves are in a terrible condition. I'm just a bundle of nerves. If my nerves were only better." Actually, there is nothing wrong with the nerves in EII, emotionally induced illness. They are just as organically normal as the rest of the body. All the nerves have to do with it is that they act as a messenger telling the colon to contract or telling the heart to speed up. As I say, we've known for a long time that the nervous system was in some vague sort of way tied up in EII, emotionally induced illness. Then doctors like Lange, Cannon, Dunbar, Wolfe, and many others began to show us more precisely just how the thing works. We reviewed a few of these mechanisms that are mediated by the nervous system in the last 2 chapters. Dr. Hans C. Jai. Then along came Dr. Hans Selye of Montreal. 1. He started his work as recently as 1936. Many others have joined him, or have followed the leads Dr. Selye pioneered. And today, a tremendous and amazing new chapter, a new understanding, is being written on emotionally induced illness. The wildest things we imagined before 1936, An excellent summary of Dr. Hans Selye's monumental work can be found in his book, The Story of the Adaptation Syndrome, 1952, Acta, Montreal, Canada, or could have imagined about the mechanism of EII, are a tame understatement compared to the things which have become known. And the accumulation of the new knowledge has barely started. We do know today that the group of organs in the body we call the endocrine glands have as much to do with emotional manifestation as the nervous system has. What is more important, the endocrine effects of the emotions far outweigh the nerve effects in magnitude and importance. So much so that it would be closer to the truth to say, it's my endocrines rather than, it's my nerves. The pituitary gland. Dr. Selye started with investigations of the pituitary gland. Merely from the pituitary gland's location in the most inaccessible part of the body, one might surmise that the pituitary gland must be of vital importance. Located inside the cranium on the underside of the brain, the pituitary is nestled and cradled in a complete bowl of bone, protected against almost any conceivable injury. One might surmise from this protected position, the pituitary is about the most important organ we have. And it is. The pituitary is only about the size and shape of an overgrown pea. Yet, despite this insignificant size, the pituitary is the master regulator of the entire body. It produces an amazing variety of hormones. Hormones are substances carried in the blood which act on other parts of the body, some of which are known, one of which has been secured in pure form, and several others that are suspected but not yet demonstrated. We know there is one hormone of the pituitary that raises blood pressure, another that makes smooth muscles contract, one that inhibits the kidneys from producing urine, one that stimulates the kidneys to make more urine. Then there is a whole group of hormones that regulate the other endocrine glands of the body. These other glands produce many more hormones to regulate just about everything that goes on in our bodies. Your pituitary is always on the job. The pituitary is like a key industry that works quietly but efficiently night and day, making certain commodities that are absolutely essential to the well-being of our body. The well-being of the entire body is dependent on its smooth operation. But this factory, the pituitary, is more important than that. Not only does it control our physiology in time of peace and quiet, but it becomes the key defense plant if the body is threatened in any way, shape, or form. With any kind of a threat to the safety of the body, this key industry puts out the commodity necessary to mobilize the defenses against that threat. Stress and stressors. These threats to the body Dr. Hans Selye called stressors, and the action of a stressor, a stress. The pituitary reacts to a vast variety of stressors that threaten our well-being in any way. The pituitary is not only the master regulator of the body under normal conditions, but also the organ that adapts the body to meet threatening conditions. Stressors that threaten the well-being of the body are extremely numerous. One stressor will stimulate the pituitary to produce one hormone in excess, or a combination of hormones in excess. Another stressor will stimulate the production of another hormone. Two such stressors are bacterial invasion and virus infection, in response to which the pituitary puts out a hormone that mobilizes the body defenses. Other stressors are exposure to heat or to cold, exposure to excessive moisture or dryness, severe muscular exertion, drug effects, injuries, operations, and many others. Dr. Selye learned from his experiments that the greatest stressors are the psychic stressors, the unpleasant emotions. The unpleasant emotions can stimulate any or all of the many hormones. What is more, a very acute emotion will produce immediate, profound effects to a much greater degree than will any other type of stressor. Witness the man we told about in Chapter 2, who became violently ill when his wife killed their only daughter and then took her own life. But, what is even more important, it is characteristic of emotional stress to act over a longer period of time than do the other stressors, often for months or years, whereas the stress of an infection usually lasts only a week or two and exposure to physical effects of muscular overexertion even less long. We shall see in a moment how important this long-time effect is. The diuretic hormone is relatively unimportant, but it illustrates how stressors, including emotional stress, act. The diuretic hormone makes the kidneys excrete an increased amount of urine. I'm sure you remember having had somewhat the same experience with the diuretic hormone that a boy in our local school did the other day. The boy was about to take a final examination in geography, for which he felt himself utterly unprepared. He was tense, anxious, and apprehensive. 2 minutes before the examination was about to start, the boy suddenly realized that he simply must leave the room. He didn't merely imagine that he must, he really and truly had to. His emotions had stimulated the pituitary to produce the diuretic hormone, which, in turn, stimulated the kidneys to excrete an increased amount of urine. Not to have left the room would have ended in acute misery and probably in disaster. Actually, the latter happened because the teacher was not wise in the ways of hormones and emotions, and refused to let him leave the room. The parents called me in as a sort of a medical legal advisor. The upshot was that the boy was given credit for passing the geography exam that the accident prevented him from taking. The boy can thank his stars that there are emotions and hormones. The somatotropic hormone, STH. One of the most important hormones made by the pituitary is the somatotropic hormone, known for short as STH. STH acts directly on the body, but it also induces the adrenal glands to produce dioxyate desoxycorticosterone, which also acts like STH. STH mobilizes the body's defenses, antibodies, white blood cells, and so forth, against any kind of an infection. But in addition, STH, and not the bacteria, produces the picture we know simply as being sick. We used to think that the picture of being sick was directly due to the toxins of the bacteria or virus. Dr. Selye has shown beyond question that STH is responsible for our being sick. Any infecting agent produces the same general initial picture. If the infection is mild, as with a cold or light flu, the picture of sickness is very mild, perhaps a headache, tiredness, loss of appetite, and an increase in temperature of a few tenths of a degree. But if the infection is more severe, the production of STH is greater, and the picture is much more severe. Locally, at the site of the infection, there is an inflammation with redness, swelling, and heat. The temperature may rapidly climb to 105 deg. As in pneumonia, there are general aches and pains, headaches, gastrointestinal upsets, loss of appetite, loss of weight, albumin in the urine, an increased elimination of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphates, and often a skin rash. All these effects, and many more, are produced by STH. As we shall see later, they disappear very rapidly if one injects ACTH, which opposes STH. But the main importance of STH is that it mobilizes the defenses of the body against infection at the same time that it produces the symptoms of being sick. It mobilizes the antibodies and the phagocytic cells. In fact, the symptoms of being sick are in themselves a defensive and beneficial reaction to an invading germ. If it were not for STH, we would die with the first cold. STH is also stressed by dark, dismal, futile, despairing emotions. One will see patients like Mrs. G, who, when she gets an ordinary cold that produces a mild STH stress, becomes morbidly despondent and despairing at the idea of having a cold. Consequently, she adds the emotional stress of STH to that of the infection. As a result, Mrs. G is always as sick with a very mild cold as she would be with a severe pneumonia. Actually, her resistance to infection is superb because of the splendid STH output. But even after every sign of the infection has disappeared, she continues to be sick for a long time because her emotions are continuing the STH output. Her attitude at the beginning of a cold is, "Oh dear, dear me, here is one of these awful colds again. And now woe is me, I'll be dreadfully sick all winter and into the summer. These colds are always so terrible, and they get me down so hard. My back aches terribly. This headache is killing me. I know this will end up with kidney infection, and so forth." It is not exaggerating a bit to say that Mrs. G frequently goes through all the agony of one of her long drawn-out colds without ever actually having a cold infection. I've seen her several times when she thought she was getting a cold. Actually, there wasn't the least evidence of an infection present, but her emotional stimulation of STH was sufficient to produce a severe picture of being sick. The funny and truthful thing is that Mrs. G is just as sick as she says she is. It counteracts STH. A very opposite type of thing happens in a person who has an infection, but who has also the aggressively disagreeable type of emotions which stress ACTH. As we shall see in a moment, ACTH counteracts all the effects of STH, including the defensive action against infection. This person will have a severe infection which at first does not seem serious because ACTH is toning down the picture of being sick. This person will go on to develop all the complications in the book. We shall give a picture of such a person later. Prolonged STH stress. STH stress disease. Prolonged, low-grade STH stress can be produced by a low-grade chronic infection, such as one might have in the tonsils or in the infected root of a tooth, but prolonged STH stress is more apt to be produced by prolonged bad emotions. Whether it be a prolonged infection or prolonged emotions, the final effect will be the same. Under such low-grade STH stress, a person is tired, possibly has many aches and pains and other symptoms of the acute STH picture. With prolonged STH stress, new disease processes are started. Dr. Celli became acquainted with these STH stress diseases by injecting STH into animals over a considerable period of time. Later he showed that these many changes could also be produced in animals by chronic infection or by prolonged emotions. If he injected STH and conditioned the animal with a high-salt diet, the animal developed a malignant type of high blood pressure. If he conditioned the animal with a high-protein diet, STH injection would then produce nephrosclerosis, a very severe type of kidney disease. If the conditioning factor were cold and wet to the joints, STH would produce rheumatoid arthritis, one of the worst varieties of arthritis. If conditioned by inhalations of mildly irritating bronchial inhalants, which by themselves had no bad after effects, the animals would develop asthma from the STH. If the conditioning were a spastic colon, STH would produce severe ulcerative colitis. Other conditions as well are produced by STH, all of them diseases of which we previously did not know the cause, such as periarteritis nodosa, lupus erythematosus disseminata, and some others with high-sounding names. What is known as the allergic state is in some way, as yet undetermined, tied up with STH. Asthma, an STH stress disease. We begin to understand the role of emotions in asthma through the work of Dr. Celli. Time was, not too long ago, when we thought that all asthma was a sensitization to some protein outside the body. It was discouraging that in very few cases of asthma could such a connection be proven. A few years ago, we began to accept the obvious evidence that many cases of asthma definitely took their onset from a bronchial infection and became worse with every renewed infection. And now we are seeing how, due to STH production, just as in the case of an infection, asthma can be generated by the emotions and be made worse by emotional tension. Mrs. D seemed to be a reasonably happy woman who was very active socially and civically in the medium-sized city in which she lived. Her children grew up. One of the daughters married badly and became a problem. Mrs. D's husband, at the foolish and experimental age of 53, had a perfectly foolish affair, which nearly prostrated Mrs. D. Finally, as an outlet or escape, Mrs. D went into office work, worked long hours at the job, and then worked into the wee hours at home, only to have her boss in the office tell her how perfectly awful her work was. After such a day, at her wits' end for recognition, feeling completely isolated and alone, and thoroughly tired, Mrs. D developed her first attack of asthma. The next day, the asthma was bad enough to necessitate hospitalization. For the next 6 months, Mrs. D was in the hospital, or hospitals, she went all over, without finding more than temporary relief. On the surface, she was a smiling, agreeable individual, seemingly with no great trouble, but fundamentally she was tense, discouraged, forlorn, and futile. The bottom had dropped out of her life. The office job was a last attempt to establish her usefulness, and that failed. She tried hard to be jolly. It was a laudable effort. Her asthma then became her greatest apprehension. Her fears increased with each attack, and consequently, each attack became more severe and more difficult to control. Infection stress versus emotional stress. It is easily possible to distinguish between the patients who have their asthma on an infectious basis and those who have it on an emotional basis. The latter are usually the more serious cases and the more difficult to control. It is very infrequent that a patient dies of infectious asthma, but I have seen a number die of emotionally induced asthma. It is also possible to separate patients whose rheumatoid arthritis is developed on an infection stress basis from those whose malady is developed on an emotional stress basis. Here again, the latter are the more severe. Sam and his chronic STH stress disease. Sam, a farmer who has had a lifetime of dismal, discouraged, futile emotions, just the kind to stress STH, has had a long picture of STH stress disease. When Sam was comparatively young, he developed rheumatoid arthritis, not very severe, not crippling, but painful. Later, he developed asthma, again not so severely that he couldn't go on working. Later, he developed high blood pressure, and now he has nephrosclerosis. One can say, and with truth, that all these illnesses must have helped to produce Sam's morose outlook. But the most important truth is that Sam's outlook was responsible for the illness. The adrenocorticotropic hormone ACTH. The ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, of the pituitary, does not act directly on the body, but on the adrenal glands, stimulating the latter to produce cortisone, which acts on the body in many remarkable ways. However, since cortisone is produced under the stimulation of ACTH, we will refer to its action as being that of ACTH. The chief effect of ACTH is to oppose the action of STH. By giving ACTH in large enough amounts, one can completely counteract the effect of STH, the inflammatory effect, the defense against infection, the picture of being sick. This action is one of the most dramatic things that has ever been demonstrated in medicine. One has to see it to believe it. For instance, a patient may be sick with a severe lobar pneumonia. His temperature is 105 deg F. His face is flushed, his lips are blue, his respiration is rapid, he has a stabbing pain in the chest, he is tired and exhausted, and aches all over, the skin is dry, the tongue furred, the eyes glassy. If the doctor gives him sufficient ACTH intravenously, within a matter of 4 hours, the temperature is normal, the flush is gone, the pain is gone, the tiredness is gone, he breathes easily, he feels strong, he can walk around with ease, and eat a good meal. He looks as though he had never been sick. One would say, looking at him, that he is cured. But all that has actually happened is that the STH effects have been cancelled out. The infection is still there, now unopposed by the defensive action of STH. If one kept giving ACTH, the infection would go on like a prairie fire. Even though the individual felt well, lung abscesses would develop, or emphysema, and the patient would certainly have a fatal termination. ACTH would have the same symptom-relieving effect in any infection and would produce a fatal outcome. That is why one is careful not to give ACTH to a person who has ever had tuberculosis for fear of lighting up the old infection. However, it is quite a different thing if one gives ACTH to a person who has ST stress disease. In that case, there is no infection. For example, if one gives ACTH to a person who has rheumatoid arthritis or bronchial asthma, the asthma or the arthritis will completely disappear, as long as the administration of ACTH is continued. But the asthma and arthritis reappear again when the ACTH is stopped, because nothing has been done to stop the STH stress. ACTH has been used and successfully in all the STH stress diseases. However, there is one very great limitation to its use in the present state of our knowledge, that is, that the continued use of ACTH leads to ACTH stress disease, just as STH did. ACTH stress disease. The only two ways that we know a person can get ACTH stress disease is either by prolonged injection of ACTH in one of the STH stress diseases or through prolonged emotional stress. The type of emotions that stimulate ACTH are the aggressively unpleasant emotions, the emotions one gets by driving oneself relentlessly toward a goal, or the emotion of militant dissatisfaction. A common ACTH stress effect is peptic ulcer. Practically every animal receiving ACTH for any length of time develops an ulcer, and the same is true in humans. Ulcer is an executive's disease because the emotions that stress ACTH are the emotions an executive is apt to have. However, executives are not the only ones who have the particular brand of emotions necessary to get an ulcer. Anyone who is aggressively dissatisfied is a candidate. In some very noisy occupations, such as a body grinding department in an automobile body plant, a high percentage of workers develop an ulcer. Ulcers can easily be produced in rats by subjecting them to irritating high-pitched noises. But let's look at a surprising chemical effect of ACTH overproduction, remembering that there is no chemical activity in the body, which is a tremendously complicated chemical plant, that is not in some way under the direction of the endocrine system, and realizing that the effect of emotional endocrine stress on chemical actions is both terrific and manifold. An important ACTH stress experiment. Dr. Selye and his co-workers selected 2 groups of Montreal children. One group was chosen from homes in which there was a terrific amount of trouble and in which everyone was unhappy in eluding the children. The other group of children were chosen from homes that were happy and in which the children were happy. These 2 groups were fed in the university mess hall on the same diet, a very excellent, well-prepared diet. Dietitians were present to see that the children ate their meals and liked their food. Excepting for their meals in the mess hall, all the children went their usual ways and lived as they were accustomed to live. At the end of a given time, it was found that the children from the happy homes had gained weight well above the normal average for the age, whereas the group of children from the unhappy homes, although they were on the same diet, had not kept their weight gain up to normal for their age. During the period of the experiment, it was determined by actual assay that the unhappy children were stressing their pituitaries to produce an excessive amount of ACTH. This in turn produced cortisone, and cortisone affected the metabolism of protein in an interesting way. The amino acids, which is the form in which protein is absorbed from the intestine into the blood, were changed in increasing amounts into glucose by the ACTH, and less than the usual amount into protein for bodybuilding. Many of the unhappy children were at times in a negative nitrogen balance. That is, they were losing more protein from their bodies than they were making, in spite of their excellent diet. The reverse was true of the children from the happy homes. They were stimulating their pituitaries optimally. Their amino acids were being changed into protein in optimal amounts. The stressed children also had a greater number of infections during the time of the observation, because ACTH overproduction was also lowering the resistance to infection, which is, you remember, dependent on STH. The picture of chronic ACTH stress disease: one sees people who are chronically dissatisfied all their lives. They are aggressively resentful, quick to be upset, quick to be hurt, long to hold a grudge, always struggling to change something or somebody the way they want. Mrs. Five was exactly such a person. Her life was a chain of illnesses, each a new ACTH stress disease. In her girlhood, she had a succession of boils, colds, and abscesses. No one could understand why she had no resistance to infection. She didn't like her teachers or the way they ran the school. She often became angry at her schoolmates. She became a store clerk, but contracted tuberculosis. After a period in the sanatorium, she married. Her husband then became the central object of her dissatisfaction, principally because his earning power cramped her possibilities. When I first saw her, she had an ulcer and a tremendously irritable colon. The ulcer refused to heal over a period of years, even under the most meticulous medical care. She was in such a continual emotional dither that even the usually willing surgeons refused to perform an ulcer operation. But over the years, the cicatrix produced by the ulcer gradually closed the outlet of the stomach, and surgery finally became an emergency. She did poorly after surgery, healed slowly, and never really pulled herself back together. Immediately after surgery, she had an infection of the lung, which gradually became worse until she had multiple lung abscesses. A portion of the lung finally had to be removed. Next, she had rectal fistulas. At the age of 50, she had a painful and well-developed osteoporosis. One cannot predict what this poor woman will develop next. Her illness, of course, has roughened her disposition, but the important relationship is the other way around. The thing which immediately strikes us about people like Mrs. Five is their personality, in which emotional stress stands out like the nose on their face. Not infrequently, these people take to alcohol to give themselves temporary relief from the effects of their emotions. They readily become chronic alcoholics and develop cirrhosis of the liver because, with alcohol as a conditioning factor, cirrhosis occurs as the result of ACTH overproduction. The future of endocrine research. In this chapter, we have considered emotional stress as it affects only two of the hormones of the pituitary gland, and the effects of these two hormones only in a very sketchy way. What happens when combinations of hormones are relatively stressed in differing amounts is still a subject for future investigation. In fact, the subject of endocrine stress has been barely opened. But already a new era is imminent in the treatment of stress disease. The high spots of Chapter 4. The endocrine glands: pituitary, adrenals, thyroid, parathyroids, thymus, pancreas, and gonads, govern and regulate the normal functions of our bodies. But they also start and regulate the body's reaction to stressing, threatening forces. The pituitary is the master endocrine that controls all the others. The pituitary responds to stress by producing one or more of its 12 hormones in increased amounts. Common stresses are bacterial or viral infection, exposure to heat, cold, moisture, dryness, or high altitudes, muscular overexertion, starvation, and many others. But the most important stress of all is that of the stressing emotions. Emotional stress can be greater than any other stress. Emotions usually act for a longer time than do other stressors, and they can produce the same effects as any other type of stress. An infection stresses the pituitary to overproduce STH. The emotions of defeat, futility, and discouragement have exactly the same action. The immediate effects of STH are tiredness, general aching, nausea, weakness, as well as inflammations and defense against bacteria. Small increases of STH over a long period of time produce a variety of conditions: asthma, rheumatoid arthritis, high blood pressure, nephrosclerosis, periarteritis, lupus erythematosus, and others. The aggressively unpleasant type of emotions, such as an executive, must often have to be an executive, or that a crusader or reformer might have, stress the pituitary's production of ACTH. ACTH stops all the effects of STH, including the defense against infection. ACTH also produces peptic ulcers, a variety of diabetes, a diminution of the available protein in the body, and other changes. In short, consider what you're doing to yourself before you give vent to an emotion. Good emotions are your best medicine. Good emotions are the best medicine in the few years since medical men began to understand the mechanism of functional disease. They have been so occupied with telling the bad effects of the wrong emotions that they have neglected to stress the effects of the good emotions. These last are just as beneficial to the person having them as the wrong emotions are detrimental. As a matter of fact, the good emotions are the greatest power for your good health that we know anything about. The only medicines we have whose power is comparable to the power of good emotions are the antibiotics, such as penicillin, on the one hand, and ACTH and cortisone on the other. The usefulness of ACTH and cortisone are limited by their possible bad effects. We have not learned to give ACTH or cortisone without producing the ill effects of ACTH stress disease. The body knows the secret of optimal hormone balance. We do not. But there is one way you have of achieving optimal hormone balance. That is to provide your body with the stimulus of the pleasant and cheerful group of emotions. The physiologic effects of the good emotions are just as great in the right direction as the effects of the bad emotions are in the wrong direction. The medicinal value of the good emotions cannot be overestimated. Dr. Paul White of Boston, one of the country's leading heart specialists, was one of the first men to call attention to this fact. The powerful effect of good emotions. Dr. White, in the Annals of Internal Medicine for December 1951, gave examples to illustrate his point. In the days before we knew anything about ACTH, he had a patient, a young mother with 2 children, and a drunken, worthless husband, who developed a serious case of rheumatic fever. She had been in bed 3 years and her doctors gave her, at most, another year to live. Rheumatic fever is another disease which Dr. Hans Selye has produced in animals with STH and the proper conditioning, and today this young woman would receive ACTH or cortisone with resultant amelioration of her illness. But at the time of this story it was, of course, not available. The young woman's emotional state was at a terrifically low ebb, Even her will to get well had left. Then a blessing in disguise occurred. Her husband pulled out for parts unknown, leaving the mother and 2 children without even the meager support he had been giving. The patient rose to the occasion, and the occasion pulled her out of the doldrums. When Dr. White came to see her, she said firmly, "Dr. White, I'm going to get out of bed and support my 2 children." Dr. White answered, "My dear lady, I wish you could, but your heart wouldn't stand it." Now it wasn't, mind you, that Dr. White was underestimating her heart. A man like Dr. Paul White knows a heart when he examines one, and knows what can be expected of it. But Dr. White was underestimating the physiologic effects of ACTH, which were unknown at the time, and the possibility that certain emotions could stimulate the production of ACTH and produce a normal hormonal spectrum. Despite Dr. White's advice, the young woman, with courage, determination, enthusiasm, and cheerfulness, got out of bed and went to work. She supported and reared her 2 children for 8 years. Any observant physician can tell you similar stories out of his own practice. One commonly sees such examples after surgery. One of the surgeons in our clinic did a very extensive and difficult piece of surgery to save a man's life from a malignancy. 3 days after surgery, the surgeon asked me to see the patient, saying, "The man is going to die." I looked at his hospital chart, and from the record it certainly did look as though he were going to die. I went into his room. The man was conscious, but that was about all. I said, "Henry, how are you today?" Henry pulled a generous smile, put a glow of determined enthusiasm into his eyes. I don't know where he got the strength to do it, and answered with a genuine, sincere feeling, "Fine. I'm going to be out of here in a few days." And that remained Henry's attitude. He got well. If he had accepted the emotions of despair and defeat that his condition warranted, I am sure Henry would have died. Another remarkable individual I will never forget was a middle-aged lady who was in the hospital because of an uncontrollable hemorrhagic disease. Every day, her condition grew seemingly worse. Every time I came on the wards, I no longer expected to find her alive. But whenever I asked her how she felt, "I feel fine and I want to sit up today. I'm going home soon," she maintained that cheerfulness and courage. She got well, not because of any treatment I gave her, but because of the treatment her emotions gave her. The good emotions produce an optimal hormone balance. These people stimulate their pituitaries in just the proper optimal way to produce a balance of hormones such as we cannot achieve by giving the hormones artificially. Don't forget, these are the same hormones, just as powerful and just as effective as those we were talking about in the last chapter. But the right kind of emotions produce these hormones in the right amounts, just as the wrong kind of emotions produce them in harmful amounts. Good emotions work miracles. Our knowledge of hormones, incomplete and fragmentary though it still is, sheds light on many seemingly miraculous cures. As we understand it better, our natural world becomes increasingly wonderful and thousands of times more amazing than the ancients thought it to be. Let's take a case for illustration. Before the days of antimicrobials, a colored man had a kidney infection. Of course, the antimicrobials would now clear this up in 24 hours. But in 1934 it was a serious affair. The man had always been irritable and aggressively disagreeable. He gradually grew worse. He had the type of emotions which stimulate ACTH. He was counteracting any defensive action STH might have. He was providing no resistance to the infection. Then a voodoo healer got hold of the man. He changed the man's emotions to the cheerful ones, gave him enthusiasm, hope, and a terrific courage, all of which, mind you, I had been unable to do. What happened in the man was that an optimal balance of hormones, allowed the maximum defensive mobilization of STH. The body's own immunity reactions were all the treatment we had at that time. The man got better. The same effect would have occurred had his emotions been changed to the good by any other means, for example, a romantic love affair. The important thing was not the means, but the right kind of emotions. This kind of thing has been going on ever since the human race started. We are only beginning to appreciate its true significance. The good emotions work in two ways. Don't forget that the good emotions have two general effects. First, they replace the bad emotions which were producing stress effects. And secondly, they produce their own pituitary effect, which is an optimal balance of endocrine function. It is this optimal balance which produces the state which we human beings have always called, "Gee, I feel good." But the first effect, that of replacing the bad emotions and their stress effects, is equally important. Why not live? Once we appreciate that healthful living is more a matter of having the right kind of emotions than anything else, it becomes apparent that the most important aspect of living consists in training and handling our emotions. So far, education has consisted largely in educating our intelligence, which is quite necessary also. But one can have a very high intelligence and very bad emotions and live perfectly miserably. If it were a matter of one or the other, life would be sweeter with good emotions and low intelligence. As a matter of fact, if one goes about it right, it is easier to acquire good emotions than a good intelligence. And there is actually no need for anyone to have bad emotions. So many people do have bad emotions because, for so many thousands of years, we have neglected to train people in emotional control. This chapter in a nutshell. The healthy emotions have just as great an effect on the pituitary as the stressing emotions do. Their effect is just as powerful in the direction of good health as the effect of the stressing emotions is toward bad health. The healthy emotions, such as equanimity, resignation, courage, determination, and cheerfulness, stimulate the pituitary to produce an optimal hormone spectrum, an effect with far greater power for good health than any drug or set of drugs that we know anything about. Your fundamental and your superficial emotions. You have two emotional levels at all times. There is one more important point to understand about emotions if we are to understand their effect on us. We all are always having emotions on two different levels at the same moment. Or you might say that we have two layers of emotions, an outside layer that everyone sees, and an inside deep layer that no one sees unless he has learned to spy beneath the surface. The emotions in the deep underlying layer we may call the fundamental emotions. Those in the outside layer we may call the superficial emotions. We can best understand these two varieties by an example. Let us suppose that this morning you committed a misdeed or a crime. Let us also suppose it is your first crime, and you are obviously not a hardened criminal. You are afraid. You have a feeling of guilt. You wish mightily that the moment of your dreadful deed might be blotted away or relived without crime. Most of all, of course, you are expecting to be apprehended by the police, who are on your trail. For the next hours, for the next days, perhaps, you will constantly have a fundamental emotion of fear, anxiety, remorse. The emotion is the manifestation. Without the bodily changes, there would be no emotion. And so, every minute of those wakeful, apprehensive hours or days, the emotion will be tightening muscles, overstimulating the endocrine glands. Because of these manifestations, you will, doubtless, feel unwell. There may be moments during those hours when your mind will necessarily have to be on other subjects, and there may be a play of superficial emotions, some of which may be seemingly cheerful and pleasant, even though the fundamental emotion is continuing its manifestations unchecked. There are moments when to an outsider you seem happy, you're joking sincere, and your heart light. But inside, all the time, you know the real state of affairs, because you can feel that dreadful sensation in your stomach even when you are laughing at someone's joke. The fundamental emotion continues through your day like a backdrop on a stage. The superficial emotions flit about before the backdrop and hold the stage for their little time, but before them, and during them, and after them, the backdrop of fundamental emotions continues. Fundamental emotions have the greatest effect. Such fundamental emotions have more to do with bringing on functional disease than do the superficial emotions, because they are constant, because they are often very basically unhappy, and because they often continue for a very long time, longer than the event or situation that started them. Fundamental emotions may last an entire lifetime, constantly producing symptoms of disease, without the person being precisely aware that the fundamental emotion exists, and without those near and with him sensing its presence. For example, Walter, age 27, was a friendly young man, likable and pleasant, and generally regarded by the people who patronized his gas station as a happy fellow. To those who knew him better, like his wife, he had moments when he looked apprehensive, became pensive with a serious look in his eyes, as though he were looking for something to happen. Not even his friends knew he had a chronic diarrhea which had grown steadily worse ever since he was 6 years old. At age 5, Walter was riding with his father on a wagon. Suddenly, there was a storm coming. A bolt of lightning killed his father and the 2 horses. From then on, Walter was never without a fundamental emotion of fear and anxiety, which manifested itself in part in the colon. The fundamental emotion was present regardless of what his superficial emotions might be. Battle emotions, battles or other dreadful frightening events, may produce emotions which carry on for years, even though the person's surface may often appear smooth, cheerful, and unruffled. Fundamental emotions from unfilled basic needs. One of the commonest causes of a prolonged, severely unhappy fundamental emotion is an unfilled basic psychological need, 6 of which, love, security, recognition, creative expression, new experiences, self-esteem, we discuss in Chapter 14. Fundamental emotions from immaturity. Another common cause of unfavorable fundamental emotions is immaturity and the consequent problems which an immature personality manufactures for itself. Some of these we discuss in Chapter 7. Cheerful fundamental emotions. Fortunate is the person who has a layer of fundamental emotions that are habitually cheerful. He has what we call a cheerful disposition, and it is worth more to him than wealth of all the world. In fact, it is hardly ever found where there is wealth. A cheerful and pleasant disposition, that is to say, happy fundamental emotions, should be the central aim in the raising of children. Give them this, and they will have more than they can ever get in any other way. If you've grown up without a naturally happy disposition, it is not too late to cultivate one. It calls for the constant practice of a few principles that are simple, and which we will present in Part 2 of this book. Points to remember in this chapter. Each of us has at all times 2 different sets of emotions. Each set is making its own physical and chemical changes in our bodies. The superficial emotions are the set we have out on the surface from minute to minute, such as our radiant pleasantness when someone gives us a box of candy. The fundamental or deeper emotions are the ones that are the background of the world we are living in, the feeling that persists inside us when our son is a prisoner in the enemy's hands, or a feeling of the dark, dismal view of the world our parents may have given us, or the general tone of apprehension we have when a loved one is sick. A person may have an outwardly genial manner, and yet have a set of fundamental emotions which are doing him no good. Sometimes, the fundamental emotions may be the result of unfulfilled psychological needs. Sometimes they may result from the effects of immaturity, and sometimes they may be due to factors which the person does not admit to exist. The only satisfactory fundamental emotions are those that go with the person who has acquired a truly happy disposition, who has learned to maintain emotions of equanimity, resignation, courage, determination, and cheerfulness.